The morning sun rose over London with a golden glow that seemed to paint the entire city in shades of hope and celebration. It was the day everyone had been waiting for, a moment that would be written in the history books for generations to come. The coronation ceremony was about to begin, and the whole world was watching. Westminster Abbey stood tall and proud, its ancient stones holding centuries of royal memories within its walls. Today it would witness yet another chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. Inside the royal residence, the Prince and Princess of Wales were getting ready for the grand occasion. William stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting his ceremonial uniform with careful precision. The dark blue fabric was adorned with golden braiding and metals that caught the light with every movement. He looked every bit the future king, dignified and composed, yet there was a softness in his eyes as he thought about the day ahead. This was not just any royal event. This was his father's coronation, a moment that marked a new era for the kingdom and for his own family. Kate emerged from the dressing room looking absolutely radiant. Her gown was a masterpiece of elegance, flowing silk in a soft ivory shade that complemented her graceful figure. The dress featured delicate embroidery along the bodice, intricate patterns that told stories of British heritage and craftsmanship. Her hair was styled in soft waves, held in place by a beautiful headpiece that sparkled subtly when she moved. She wore jewelry that had been passed down through generations of royal women, each piece carrying its own history and significance. The children were in the next room, being helped by their nanny. George, the eldest, was dressed in a miniature version of his father's uniform. At his young age, he already showed signs of understanding the weight of his position. He stood still as the nanny made final adjustments to his outfit, his face serious and thoughtful. Charlotte twirled in her white dress, the skirt billowing around her like a cloud. Her dress was adorned with tiny flowers and ribbons, making her look like a princess from a fairy tale. Louis, the youngest, was full of energy despite the early hour. His little suit made him look incredibly smart, though he kept trying to loosen his collar and complained that his shoes felt too tight. William walked into the children's room and smiled at the scene before him. George looked up at his father with wide eyes, seeking reassurance. William knelt down beside him and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He spoke quietly to his son, explaining what the day would bring, what they would see, and how they should behave. George nodded slowly, taking in every word. William could see his own childhood reflected in those young eyes, remembering how he had once stood in similar situations, learning the responsibilities that came with royal life. Kate joined them, and Charlotte immediately rushed to her mother, grabbing her hand. The little girl looked up at Kate with excitement and asked if she would sit next to her during the ceremony. Kate smiled warmly and promised that they would all be together. She reached down and smoothed a stray curl away from Charlotte's forehead, her touch tender and loving. Louis bounded over to his parents, chattering excitedly about the horses and carriages he had seen from the window earlier. He wanted to know if he could ride in one, and William chuckled, explaining that they would all ride together in the royal carriage. The palace staff moved efficiently through the corridors, making final preparations. Security personnel checked every corner of the route the royal family would take. Outside, crowds had been gathering since dawn, lining the streets with flags and banners. People from all walks of life had come to witness this historic moment. Some had traveled from distant corners of the United Kingdom, while others had flown in from countries around the globe. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and joy. As the time to leave approached, William gathered his family in the grand hallway. He looked at each of them with pride and love. Kate stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on George's shoulder. Charlotte held her mother's other hand, while Louis stood close to his father, occasionally bouncing on his toes with barely contained excitement. The family shared a quiet moment together before the public spectacle began. William whispered something to Kate, and she nodded with a serene smile. They were ready. The children might not fully understand the magnitude of what was about to happen, but they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. The doors to the palace opened, and the sound of the waiting crowd surged forward like a wave. The royal carriage waited at the foot of the steps, its golden exterior gleaming in the sunlight. Footmen in ceremonial dress stood at attention, ready to assist the family into the carriage. William stepped out first, raising his hand in acknowledgement of the cheers that erupted from the assembled crowd. Kate followed, her presence commanding immediate attention. The children emerged one by one, their faces showing a mixture of wonder and nervousness at the sight of so many people. The family climbed into the carriage, settling into the plush seats. Through the windows, they could see the sea of faces, all turned toward them with expressions of joy and celebration. Flags waved in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. The carriage lurched gently forward, beginning its journey through the streets of London toward Westminster Abbey. Inside, William reached for Kate's hand, and she gave it a reassuring squeeze. George sat up straight, determined to make his parents proud. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, taking in every detail of the spectacle. Louis waved enthusiastically at everyone he saw, his earlier nervousness forgotten in the excitement of the moment. The coronation had begun. The royal carriage made its way through the crowded streets of London, moving at a steady, ceremonial pace. The horses that pulled it were magnificent creatures, their coats brushed to perfection, their movements precise and trained. They wore decorative harnesses that gleamed with polished brass and leather. The coachman, dressed in traditional livery, guided the horses with expert skill, maintaining perfect formation despite the overwhelming noise and energy of the crowd. Every turn of the wheels brought the family closer to Westminster Abbey and the historic ceremony that awaited them. Inside the carriage, the children were mesmerized by everything they saw. Charlotte pointed out landmarks she recognized from her lessons, whispering excitedly to her brothers. George tried to maintain his composure, but even he could not help stealing glances at the extraordinary scene unfolding outside. Louis's eyes were wide with wonder, trying to take in everything at once. The buildings were decorated with banners and bunting in red, white, and blue. Windows were filled with people waving and cheering. Some held signs with messages of congratulations and support. Others simply stood in silence, overcome with emotion at witnessing such a momentous occasion. William and Kate exchanged glances, communicating without words in the way that long-married couples often do. They both felt the weight of the moment, understanding that this day would shape their children's understanding of duty, service, and what it meant to be part of the royal family. Kate adjusted Charlotte's hair ribbon gently, while William reminded George to keep his back straight. These small gestures of care and guidance were their way of providing comfort and stability in the midst of such grandeur and formality. As the carriage turned onto the Mall, the crowd grew even denser. Thousands upon thousands of people lined both sides of the wide avenue, creating a human corridor that stretched as far as the eye could see. The roar of their voices was almost deafening. They called out greetings and blessings, sang patriotic songs, and waved their flags with tireless enthusiasm. The sound rolled over the carriage like thunder, a powerful expression of public affection and support. William raised his hand in acknowledgement, offering the crowd a smile that balanced warmth with regal dignity. Kate did the same, her wave graceful and practiced, her smile genuine. The children were encouraged to wave as well. Charlotte took to it naturally, her small hand moving back and forth with enthusiasm. She seemed to understand instinctively that these people had come to share in something special, and she wanted to acknowledge their presence. George's waves were more measured, more controlled, as he tried to copy his father's movements exactly. Louis waved with both hands, sometimes standing up despite Kate's gentle reminders to remain seated. His innocent joy was infectious, and many in the crowd laughed and cheered even louder when they saw him. The procession included other carriages carrying various members of the royal family and distinguished guests. Behind and ahead of William's carriage, mounted guards rode in formation. Their uniforms were impeccable, their posture perfect. The sound of the horses' hooves on the pavement created a rhythmic soundtrack to the journey. Military bands positioned at intervals along the route played stirring music, adding to the sense of pageantry and celebration. The whole scene felt like something out of a dream, a perfect blend of tradition and modernity. Inside the carriage, Louis suddenly became quiet. The initial excitement had worn off, and he was starting to feel overwhelmed by everything happening around him. Kate noticed immediately and pulled him close, wrapping an arm around his small shoulders. She whispered reassurances in his ear, telling him how brave he was being and how proud everyone was of him. William leaned over and ruffled Louis's hair affectionately, making the boy smile. Charlotte, sensing her younger brother's discomfort, reached across and took his hand. The simple gesture of sibling solidarity seemed to restore Louis's confidence, and soon he was looking out the window again with renewed interest. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the character of the crowd changed. Here the people were more formally dressed, many wearing their finest clothes for this once-in-a-lifetime event. Some wore traditional outfits representing different regions of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth nations. The diversity was stunning, a visual reminder of the global reach and multicultural nature of the modern monarchy. Television cameras lined the route, their operators carefully capturing every moment for broadcast to millions of viewers around the world. The ancient abbey came into view, its Gothic towers rising majestically against the sky. The building had witnessed coronations for nearly 1,000 years, and its very stones seemed to emanate history and significance. Flags flew from its towers, and the great bells in its towers rang out in celebration. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air and settling in the chest of everyone who heard it. William felt a shiver run down his spine. This was the place where his own future would one day be shaped, where he would eventually take his own sacred oaths. But today was his father's day, and William was determined to support him in every way possible. The carriage began to slow as it reached the entrance to Westminster Abbey. Guards in ceremonial uniform stood at attention, forming perfect lines on either side of the path. Officials in formal robes waited to greet the arriving guests. The massive doors of the abbey stood open, revealing glimpses of the ornate interior beyond. Kate took a deep breath, steadying herself for the moment when they would step out of the private space of the carriage and into the full glare of public attention. William squeezed her hand one more time. George straightened his uniform. Charlotte checked her dress. Louis took his mother's hand. The carriage came to a complete stop. The door was opened. It was time. William stepped out of the carriage first, his movements smooth and confident despite the enormity of the moment. He turned and offered his hand to Kate, helping her down with practiced grace. She emerged looking serene and poised, her dress flowing elegantly as she moved. The crowd that had gathered near the abbey entrance erupted in cheers, the sound echoing off the ancient stone walls. Cameras flashed from every direction, capturing the moment for posterity. William then helped each of his children out of the carriage, making sure they were steady on their feet before releasing their hands. George descended the carriage steps carefully, mindful of his uniform and the many eyes watching him. His face was serious and concentrated, showing a maturity beyond his years. Charlotte followed, her dress catching the light as she moved. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the splendor of the abbey entrance and the assembled dignitaries. Louis came last, and for a moment he hesitated, suddenly shy in the face of so much attention. Kate bent down and whispered something encouraging in his ear, and he nodded bravely before taking the final step down. The family formed a line, with William and Kate at the center, the children positioned between them. Officials approached to greet them formally, bowing and offering words of welcome. The Dean of Westminster stood at the abbey entrance, resplendent in ceremonial robes. His presence added to the solemnity of the occasion, reminding everyone that this was not merely a political or social event, but a deeply religious ceremony with roots stretching back centuries. He smiled warmly at the children, understanding that for them, this day might be both exciting and overwhelming. As they began walking toward the entrance, Louis reached up and took his father's hand. The small gesture was captured by countless cameras and would later become one of the most beloved images of the day. It showed the human side of royalty, the simple bond between father and son that existed alongside all the ceremony and tradition. William looked down at Louis and smiled, giving his hand a reassuring squeeze. Charlotte walked beside Kate, her steps careful and measured as she had been taught. George walked with his shoulders back and his head held high, embodying the dignity expected of his position. The entrance to Westminster Abbey was breathtaking. The doorway was framed by intricate stone carvings that had survived centuries of weather and history. Banners hung from the walls, depicting royal arms and symbols of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth. The path leading into the abbey was lined with members of various military regiments, standing at perfect attention in their dress uniforms. Each regiment represented different branches of service and different periods of British history. Their presence was a reminder of the monarchy's role as head of the armed forces. As the family crossed the threshold into the abbey, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Outside had been bright and noisy, filled with the energy of the crowd and the brilliance of sunshine. Inside was cooler, quieter, and suffused with a sense of sacred purpose. The abbey's interior was magnificent, with soaring ceilings supported by elegant columns. Stained glass windows filtered the light into colorful patterns that danced across the stone floor. The air carried the faint scent of incense and flowers. Every surface seemed to tell a story, with monuments and memorials to kings, queens, poets, scientists, and heroes who had shaped the nation's history. The nave of the abbey was filled with guests, all carefully seated according to protocol. There were heads of state from around the world, members of royal families from other nations, political leaders, religious figures, and representatives from every sphere of British public life. Everyone had dressed in their finest attire, and the collective effect was dazzling. Women wore elegant gowns and elaborate hats, while men were dressed in formal morning suits or military uniforms adorned with medals and decorations. The atmosphere was one of respectful anticipation, with quiet conversations creating a soft murmur that filled the space. William and Kate walked slowly down the aisle, the children following in their carefully practiced formation. All eyes turned to watch them pass. Some guests smiled warmly, others nodded respectfully. The children handled the attention remarkably well. Charlotte kept her eyes forward, just as she had been instructed, though her curiosity was evident in the way her gaze occasionally flickered to the extraordinary sights around her. George maintained his serious demeanor, understanding the importance of setting a good example. Louis occasionally looked up at his father, drawing strength and confidence from William's calm presence. The Abbey's choir began to sing as the family proceeded. Their voices were pure and powerful, filling the vast space with sacred music. The sound seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, creating an ethereal atmosphere that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The choir boys, dressed in their traditional robes, sang with an angelic quality that seemed to connect the earthly ceremony with something greater and more profound. The music had been carefully selected to honor both tradition and the modern era, blending ancient hymns with more contemporary compositions. The family reached their designated seats in the front section of the abbey, positions that offered a clear view of the coronation chair and the altar where the ceremony would take place. As they settled into their places, William looked around at the assembled gathering. He saw family members, some he knew well and others he saw only on rare occasions. He saw the faces of people who had served the crown faithfully for decades. He saw the next generation, children like his own, who would carry forward the traditions and responsibilities of their heritage. The moment felt enormous and intimate all at once. Kate reached over and briefly touched his hand, a simple gesture that said everything that needed to be said. They were ready to witness history. The ceremony began with a fanfare of trumpets that filled Westminster Abbey with sound so powerful, it seemed to make the very stones vibrate. The clear, bright notes announced the formal commencement of the coronation, and every person in the abbey rose to their feet in unison. A hush fell over the congregation as the first strains of the processional music began. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The king, dressed in magnificent ceremonial robes, began his walk down the aisle toward the coronation chair that had been used by monarchs for over 700 years. William watched his father approach, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Pride filled his chest as he observed the dignity and grace with which his father moved. There was also a sense of awe at being part of such a momentous occasion, one that connected them to an unbroken chain of history stretching back through the centuries. He glanced at Kate, who was watching the procession with rapt attention. Her eyes glistened slightly, moved by the profound significance of what they were witnessing. She felt William's gaze and turned to meet it, offering a small smile that conveyed her understanding and support. The children watched with varying degrees of comprehension. George understood that this was an important ceremony for his grandfather, and he sat very still, determined not to do anything that might draw negative attention. His young face showed concentration as he tried to follow the proceedings. Charlotte was mesmerized by the beauty of everything around her. The robes, the music, the solemn faces of the clergy, the glittering regalia, all of it combined to create a spectacle that captured her imagination completely. She whispered quietly to Kate, asking questions about what was happening, and Kate answered in low tones, explaining the ritual in terms a child could understand. Louis found it harder to sit still. He fidgeted in his seat, swinging his legs and looking around constantly. Kate and William took turns gently reminding him to be calm, redirecting his attention to different aspects of the ceremony. When the choir sang, Louis seemed to settle, captivated by the beautiful voices. When there were long-spoken parts, he grew restless again. It was a challenge, but both parents handled it with patience and understanding, recognizing that he was still very young and doing his best in circumstances that would be difficult for any child. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood before the assembled congregation and began the formal rites. His voice was strong and clear, carrying easily through the vast space of the abbey. He spoke of duty, service, and the sacred responsibilities of monarchy. Every word had been carefully chosen, drawing on centuries of tradition while also acknowledging the modern world and the challenges it presented. The ceremony included prayers, blessings, and the administration of oaths. Each element had its own significance, its own place in the carefully choreographed ritual. The anointing was perhaps the most sacred part of the ceremony. A screen was placed around the king for this private moment, respecting the holy nature of the act. The congregation could not see, but they could imagine the ancient oil being applied, consecrating the monarch for his role as defender of the faith and servant of his people. The choir sang softly during this time, their voices creating a reverent atmosphere. William felt the weight of tradition pressing down on him, knowing that one day he too would stand in that same place, receiving that same sacred anointing. When the screen was removed, the king was presented with the various symbols of his authority. Each item was brought forward with great ceremony. The sword represented his role as protector of the realm. The orb symbolized his dominion under God. The scepters embodied his power and justice. Finally, the moment came for the crown itself to be placed upon his head. The St. Edward's crown, heavy with gold and jewels, was lifted carefully by the archbishop. Time seemed to slow as it was lowered onto the king's head. The instant it touched him, a tremendous shout went up from outside the abbey, where crowds had been following the ceremony on large screens. Inside, the congregation remained respectfully silent, but the emotion in the air was palpable. William felt tears prick his eyes. This was his father, now officially crowned king. The man who had raised him, taught him, prepared him for his own future role, had now taken on the ultimate responsibility. Kate reached over and took William's hand, squeezing it gently. She understood what he was feeling. Charlotte noticed her father's emotion and reached out to touch his arm, offering comfort in her own innocent way. Even George seemed to sense the profundity of the moment, his young face serious and thoughtful. Louis, for once, was completely still, staring at his grandfather wearing the magnificent crown. The ceremony continued with further prayers and blessings, with music and readings, each element building upon the last to create a complete ritual of consecration and commitment. The newly crowned king made his solemn pledges, promising to govern with justice and mercy, to uphold the laws of the land, to defend the faith, and to serve his people faithfully for the rest of his life. His voice was steady and strong, despite the enormous burden of the promises he was making. Every word was heard clearly throughout the abbey, carried by the excellent acoustics of the ancient building. As the ceremony drew toward its conclusion, there was a sense of something monumental having been accomplished. A new era had officially begun. The king rose from the coronation chair and, wearing the crown and holding the symbols of his authority, began to process back down the aisle. This time he walked as the crowned monarch, his position now ratified by both church and state. William, Kate, and the children would soon follow in their own procession, but for now they remained in their seats watching as history passed before them. The music swelled, the choir's voices rising in triumph and celebration. Outside, the bells of Westminster Abbey began to ring, their joyful sound carrying across London and announcing to all who could hear that the coronation was complete. After the coronation ceremony concluded, there was a brief period of organized activity as the various participants prepared to leave Westminster Abbey. The newly crowned king had already departed for the staterooms where he would prepare for the procession back to the palace. William and Kate gathered their children, making sure everyone was comfortable and ready for the next phase of this long and momentous day. George had handled everything beautifully, and William told him so, pride evident in his voice. Charlotte was bubbling with excitement, wanting to talk about everything she had seen. Louis was tired but happy, relieved that the sitting still part was over. As they made their way through the abbey toward the exit, they passed other members of the royal family and distinguished guests. There were warm exchanges, congratulations, and brief conversations. Everyone seemed to be feeling the same sense of awe and satisfaction at having witnessed such a historic event. The children received particular attention, with many guests commenting on how well behaved they had been throughout the long ceremony. Charlotte beamed at the praise while George accepted it with modest grace. Louis just wanted to know when they could go outside and see the horses again. When they emerged from the Abbey, they were greeted by an even larger crowd than before. Word of the successful coronation had spread, and the people's joy was expressed through continuous cheering, waving, and singing. The atmosphere was jubilant and celebratory. The royal family paused at the top of the Abbey steps, and the crowd's response intensified. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. William waved to the assembled masses, and Kate did the same, her smile radiant. The children waved too, their small hands moving back and forth in response to the overwhelming show of public affection. The return procession to the palace was even more elaborate than the journey to the Abbey. The newly crowned king rode in the magnificent gold state coach, a spectacular vehicle used only for coronations and major jubilees. Its golden exterior gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, and its ornate decorations showcased the finest craftsmanship of centuries past. 8 Windsor gray horses pulled the coach, their harnesses jingling musically as they moved. William, Kate, and the children followed in their own carriage, part of a grand procession that included various members of the royal family, military units, and ceremonial guards. The route back to the palace took them through different streets than the morning journey, allowing more people to see the newly crowned monarch and his family. Every window was filled with spectators, every balcony crowded with waving enthusiasts. Buildings were decorated with banners and flags, creating a riot of color that complemented the pageantry of the procession itself. Street vendors sold commemorative items. Children sat on their parents' shoulders for a better view, and impromptu celebrations broke out wherever the crowd felt particularly festive. Inside their carriage, the family finally allowed themselves to relax slightly. The formal ceremony was behind them, and while there were still obligations ahead, the pressure had eased considerably. William looked at Kate and let out a long breath he had not realized he was holding. She smiled at him, understanding completely. They had supported his father through one of the most important days of his life, and they had done so with grace and dignity. The children had been wonderful, representing the next generation of the royal family with admirable composure. Charlotte asked her mother about the crown, wanting to know if it was heavy and if it hurt to wear it for so long. Kate explained gently that yes, it was quite heavy, and that being a monarch meant carrying that weight in many ways, not just physically. The answer was perhaps deeper than Charlotte fully understood, but she nodded thoughtfully, processing this information in her own way. George listened too, storing away these lessons about duty and responsibility that would shape his own future. Louis had found a comfortable position leaning against Kate and was fighting to keep his eyes open, the excitement and early start finally catching up with him. As they approached Buckingham Palace, the crowd grew even denser. People had been waiting here for hours, hoping to see the newly crowned king appear on the famous balcony. The palace itself looked magnificent, its facade freshly cleaned and decorated for the occasion. The royal standard flew from its flagpole, indicating the monarch was in residence. Guards in their distinctive red uniforms and bearskin hats stood at attention, maintaining their positions despite the pressing crowd and the noise and excitement surrounding them. The carriage passed through the palace gates and into the courtyard, finally giving the family a moment of privacy away from the public gaze. Staff members waited to assist them as they descended from the carriage. Louis was nearly asleep now, and William carefully lifted him, carrying his youngest son with gentle care. Charlotte and George walked beside Kate, holding her hands. They all needed a brief rest before the final public appearance of the day, the traditional balcony greeting where the entire royal family would appear before the crowds. Inside the palace, they were guided to a private suite where they could refresh themselves and prepare for the balcony appearance. Kate helped Charlotte fix her dress, which had become slightly rumpled during the long day. William straightened George's uniform and his own. Louis was allowed to rest for a few precious minutes, regaining some energy. They could hear the crowd outside, a constant roar of voices and celebration that penetrated even the thick palace walls. The sound was a reminder of the public's investment in the monarchy, their desire to be part of this historic moment. Soon they would go out onto that balcony and acknowledge the people's support and affection. But for now, they took a moment to be simply a family, proud of what they had accomplished and grateful for each other's presence through it all. The moment had arrived for the balcony appearance, the final public act of this extraordinary day. Palace staff opened the doors that led to the famous balcony, and the sound of the crowd outside rushed in like a physical force. The roar was deafening, tens of thousands of voices joining together in celebration. The newly crowned king stepped out first, still wearing his crown and ceremonial robes. The crowd's response was overwhelming, a wave of sound and emotion that seemed to shake the very air. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, and the cheering grew even louder if such a thing were possible. William and Kate stepped onto the balcony next, bringing the children with them. The sight of the family together prompted another surge of excitement from the crowd below. People waved flags frantically, held up signs with messages of love and congratulations, and shouted greetings until their voices grew hoarse. The royal family spread out along the balcony, creating a tableau that would be captured by countless cameras and remembered for generations. The children stood between their parents, protected and guided by their presence. Charlotte looked out at the massive crowd with wonder in her eyes. She had never seen so many people in one place, stretching as far as she could see. The mall was completely packed, a sea of humanity united in celebration. She waved enthusiastically, delighted when people waved back at her. George stood straight and tall, waving with measured dignity, conscious of his position and responsibilities even at his young age. Louis, refreshed by his brief rest, was full of energy again. He waved with both hands, bounced on his toes, and pointed at things in the crowd that caught his attention, his innocent enthusiasm charming everyone who saw him. William looked out at the assembled crowd and felt a profound sense of connection to the people he would one day serve as king. This was not just ceremony and tradition. These were real people who had come from all walks of life to be part of something bigger than themselves. They represented the nation in all its diversity, united by their shared investment in the monarchy and what it represented. He felt the weight of future responsibility, but also the strength that came from knowing he had the support of his family and his people. Kate stood beside William, her presence a source of steady support as it had been throughout the day. She waved to the crowd, her smile genuine and warm. She had navigated the challenges of royal life with remarkable grace, balancing the demands of public duty with her role as a mother and wife. Today had tested all of them, and they had met every challenge successfully. She felt proud of her children, proud of William, and grateful for the opportunity to be part of such a significant moment in history. The Royal Air Force had planned a flyover to conclude the celebrations, and right on schedule, the distant sound of aircraft engines could be heard. The crowd began to look up, searching the sky. Then they appeared, a formation of aircraft flying in perfect alignment, their contrails painting white lines across the blue sky. The planes roared overhead in a spectacular display of precision and power. Colored smoke streamed from some of the aircraft, creating the red, white, and blue of the British flag against the heavens. The children watched in awe, pointing and exclaiming with excitement. As the aircraft completed their flyover and the sound of their engines faded into the distance, the royal family remained on the balcony for a few more minutes, continuing to wave and acknowledge the crowd. The king stood at the center, the crown on his head catching the late afternoon light. On either side of him, his family provided visible evidence of the continuity and future of the monarchy. William and Kate, with their 3 children, represented the next generation, the ones who would carry forward the traditions and adapt them to the changing world. Eventually, the time came to return inside. The family waved one final time and the crowd responded with renewed cheering and applause. As they turned to go back through the palace doors, William looked back once more at the incredible sight of so many people gathered in celebration. He knew he would remember this moment for the rest of his life, not just as a historic event, but as a reminder of the bond between the royal family and the people they served. The doors closed behind them, muffling the sound of the crowd, and they found themselves back in the relative quiet of the palace interior. The children were excited and tired in equal measure. Charlotte chattered about everything she had seen, while George quietly reflected on the day's events. Louis was carried by William again, his small head resting on his father's shoulder, ready for a well-deserved nap. Kate walked beside them, her hand resting gently on George's shoulder. They made their way through the palace corridors toward the private family rooms, where they could finally relax and be themselves, away from the cameras and the ceremony and the weight of public expectation. As the sun began to set over London, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, the day that would be remembered as one of the most significant in British history drew to a close. The coronation had been a triumph, a perfect blend of ancient tradition and modern sensibility. William, Kate, and their children had played their parts beautifully, showing the world the human side of royalty while maintaining the dignity and grace expected of their positions. They had honored the past, celebrated the present, and given people hope for the future. The crown had been passed, the oaths had been taken, and a new era had officially begun. But in the quiet of the family quarters, away from all the grandeur and ceremony, they were simply a family who had shared an extraordinary day together, supporting each other through every moment, and grateful for the love and unity that sustained them through all of life's great occasions.